The foolish builder Granite Ridge, Idaho, winter of 1908. Before the sun even touched the ridge tops, the wind arrived, thin, sharp, and merciless. People in the valley called it the snakebite wind, because it struck fast and left a sting in the bones that didn't fade for hours. Old-timers said that if you heard it before dawn, you'd better chop extra firewood, because weather that followed this wind never came softly. But on that freezing morning, only one man in all of Granite Ridge paid attention. His name was Elias Korven, an immigrant from the deep forests of Karelia, quiet as snowfall and as stubborn as the stone ridges he worked. Most folks said he carried winter inside him. Others said he carried fear. Either way, no one denied that the man prepared for cold, as if every winter were his last. For months he'd been building something strange, something no one in Idaho had ever seen. A complete wooden ring that wrapped around his cabin like a second skin. 10-foot posts, plank walls fitted tighter than barrel staves, vents carved with mathematical precision, and a roof pitched just enough to shed the heaviest snow. From a distance, the place didn't look like a homestead at all. It looked like a drum sitting in a clearing, thumping silently against the wind. The townspeople laughed. They said he was wasting lumber. They said he was overthinking the seasons. One mill worker joked that Elias must believe winter was coming to kill him personally. Another said a man who builds 2 houses probably expects both to fail. Even the children on their way home from school joined in. They'd bang sticks on the outer walls and chant, "Drum house! Drum house!" until their voices disappeared into the trees. Elias never shouted back. He simply tightened a board here, adjusted a vent there, and kept building. Only one person in town didn't mock him. Martha Callan, a widow raising 2 young children in a cabin that whistled in every storm, brought him bread one afternoon and asked, quietly, why he was building a whole shelter around his first one. Elias looked at the snow clouds gathering behind the pines before he answered. "Because winter here is young," he said. "It hasn't shown its real teeth yet." Martha didn't laugh. She'd seen enough hardship not to dismiss the warnings of a careful man. By early December, the timber ring was finished. A full circle of Idaho larch lumber, tough, resin-filled, and resistant to rot in the bitterroot winds. Every plank fit tight. Every vent aligned perfectly to drain moisture. Raised flooring kept the stacked firewood high above the creeping ground frost that reached across the valley each year. People came to stare, some to mock, some just to gawk. One rancher said the thing looked like a fort built by someone expecting war. Another said Elias must have brought the Arctic with him from the old country. Deputy Wardell rode out to inspect the place, boots crunching on frost as he tapped the outer boards with a skeptical knuckle. He wasn't a cruel man, just a practical one, and the structure confused him. "You know," he said, "stacking firewood this close to your home could be a fire hazard. Council might put it in writing." Elias met his eyes. "It won't burn," he said simply. "Not the way it's built." Wardell didn't argue, but the doubt in his expression said plenty. The truth was simple. Granite Ridge had been blessed with mild winters for half a decade. People stopped fearing the cold. They relied on tarps, flimsy lean-tos, and quick wood piles thrown together in 2 afternoons. Nobody believed a winter worth worrying about was coming. But the frontier has a way of punishing certainty. And soon, every man, woman, and child in Granite Ridge would learn that the storm approaching their valley wasn't just any winter storm. It carried the same signature Elias had seen once before. Back in Karelia, the kind of storm that didn't test your home. It tested your preparation. It tested your judgment. It tested whether you built for convenience or for survival. And when it arrived, the only person ready for what came next would be the man they spent months calling a fool. Act 2, Why He Built It. Elias Korven had not always lived in the American West. Before Idaho, before Granite Ridge, before the rumors and the laughter, there had been Karelia, the land of endless forests, frozen lakes, and winters that sometimes swallowed entire villages whole. He was only 9 years old when the storm of 1893 struck. People still talked about that winter like it had been a living creature, one with claws and breath and hunger. The winds there didn't just howl. They pressed against the walls of homes until the logs creaked like old bones. Snow didn't fall. It advanced, layer after layer, until the world outside became a white burial mound. In his memory, that terrible night flickered like a lantern flame caught in a draft. The village elders shouting, horses panicking, the sky turning the color of steel, and his father, broad-shouldered, weathered, the kind of man shaped by work rather than words, pulling Elias into their small woodshed, a structure his father had built with the same strange obsessive care that Elias would one day inherit. The boy remembered asking why they were hiding there instead of inside the cabin with everyone else. His father knelt, put a hand on the child's shoulder, and spoke the sentence that would become the foundation of Elias's entire life. "Cold doesn't kill fire," he said. "Wet does." Hours later, when the storm reached its peak, the villagers' exposed wood piles froze into glittering sculptures of ice. Fireboxes went dark. The families who had trusted simple tarps and stacked logs nearly froze before dawn. But Elias's father, because of the way he built, because he respected what moisture did to fuel, kept his family warm inside that small, tight, dry shelter. That winter carved a lesson into Elias's bones so deep he would carry it across continents. So, when he arrived in Idaho years later, he brought not just memories, but a blueprint. He began building the timber ring exactly the way his father might have done had he been born in the American West. First, the posts, 10 feet tall, driven deep into the soil and braced with river stones. Each one stood 5 feet away from the cabin walls, creating a buffer zone where air could settle and moisture would fall away instead of creeping inward. He raised the flooring 22 inches off the ground, high above the Idaho ground frost that spread beneath the snow each year like a slow, silent tide. Then came the walls, built from western larch, one of the toughest woods in the region, dense with resin and naturally resistant to decay. It was lumber, the local loggers respected but rarely used for anything other than beams. It was too hard, too stubborn, too slow to cut. Perfect, in other words, for surviving storms. But the real genius lay in the vents, thin, angled openings carved along the upper walls. Elias had learned the design from Salish hunters who spoke of crosswind drain slots, a traditional pattern that allowed trapped moisture to escape even when snow piled high. When cut at the right angle, the vents created a wind pathway that expelled damp air but blocked drifting snow. Most people never noticed them. Those who did assumed they were mistakes. While Elias worked, the town continued to laugh. Some rode by just to get a better look. Others made wagers about how long the drum would last before it collapsed. Children still tapped sticks against the walls. Even Deputy Wardle stopped by again, more curious now than mocking, but still doubtful. "You really think all this is necessary?" he asked one afternoon, leaning against his saddle. "We haven't had a serious winter in years." Elias didn't look up from his work. A mild past doesn't promise a mild future. Wardell didn't argue, but he didn't help either. He simply tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Elias alone in the clearing once more. Martha Callan brought food twice, bread once, a jar of preserved berries the next time. But even she could sense the weight of the town pressing against him. Elias thanked her softly, gratefully, but kept working long after the sun dipped behind the ridge. Each plank he set into place was a memory of Karelia. Each nail was a promise not to repeat the mistakes of a village that had underestimated winter. Each vent was a reminder of what his father taught him. Cold doesn't kill fire. Wet does. By the time the first flakes of December snow fell, the timber ring stood finished, solid, silent, waiting, and Granite Ridge still laughed. To them, it was nothing more than a strange circle of lumber wrapped around a lonely man's cabin. To Elias, it was a shield against the one enemy he knew would come, the enemy that had buried his childhood home in white, the enemy the townsfolk had forgotten, the enemy he could feel in the wind long before anyone else believed it was real. Winter. Act 3, Signs of Doom. Winter settled over Granite Ridge in a way that felt almost gentle at first. A few light snows, a few quiet mornings, the kind of season that lulled people into believing the cold would stay friendly. But nature rarely reveals its intentions all at once. Sometimes it whispers first. And Elias Korven heard the whispers long before anyone else did. The first warning came from the sky. The hawks that usually circled the ridge every morning began flying low. So low their wings almost skimmed the tops of the bare alder branches. Birds sense air pressure before humans do. When they drop altitude, they're not just hunting, they're escaping something. Then came the silence. Elias noticed it one afternoon while splitting a final row of Douglas maple. The forest, normally alive with the crackle of branches and the distant tapping of woodpeckers, fell quiet. Not peaceful quiet, compressed quiet, a kind of tightening, as if the entire tree line had drawn in a breath and was holding it. That was how the wind behaved before the Karelia storm of 1893. As the day dimmed, he felt another sign. Moisture. Not the soft, drifting kind that precedes snowfall, but a dampness pushed from the southwest, rolling in from Coeur d'Alene Lake like an unseen fog. Every true woodsman knows that when warm moisture meets incoming Arctic air, only one thing is born: a blizzard with intention. Elias stood still in the clearing, eyes half closed, listening to the forest, reading the air the way some men read scripture. The snake-bite wind was no longer biting. It was shifting, preparing. Echoes of Karelia surged through him once more. The metallic scent of cold, the thickening weight of the atmosphere, the prickling at the back of his neck. The storm coming toward Granite Ridge felt familiar. Too familiar. He walked into town the next morning, boots crunching through a thin layer of new frost, and headed straight for the meeting hall where the Granite Ridge Council was inspecting lumber taxes. They looked up as he entered, some confused, some annoyed. Elias rarely came into town unless he needed supplies. Today, he carried nothing but urgency. "There's a storm building," he said without preamble. "One not like the others. The pressure is dropping. Birds are flying low. The moisture's wrong. You have 2, maybe 3 days to prepare your fuel." The councilmen exchanged glances. One of them, Thomas Brigg, a loud man with a bigger opinion of himself than of the weather, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Idaho isn't Finland, Elias," he said. "We don't get your mythical Arctic nightmares." A few others laughed. "We've had 5 mild winters," someone added. "We'll take our chances." Elias kept his voice steady. "The signs don't lie." Brigg waved him off with a flick of his hand. "And the signs say you've been staring at that wooden ring of yours too long." The meeting went on. The warnings died in the air, but not everyone ignored him. As he stepped outside, he found Martha Callan trailing behind, her coat patched at the elbows, her breath forming pale clouds in the cold air. "What did you see?" she asked gently. "Truly?" Elias hesitated, then answered in the soft, calm way he always spoke to her. "A storm pattern I've only seen once before. The one that buried my village back home." He paused. "Your wood shelter. May I look at it?" She nodded. Together they walked back to her homestead, a small place half sheltered by the tree line. Her wood pile sat beneath a modest lean-to she had built herself, but the structure had gaps large enough for wind-driven snow to pass through. Elias examined it, then began reinforcing it with whatever materials she had on hand. He adjusted the roof angle by a few degrees, added cross braces for strength, and packed evergreen boughs along the lower edges to slow incoming drafts. As they worked, her children watched from the doorway, bundled in mismatched scarves. Martha's voice wavered when she spoke again. "Do you really think it will be that bad?" Elias didn't answer with fear, just with honesty. "I think it's safer to prepare as if it will be." When he finished, Martha pressed a gloved hand briefly over his arm, a gesture of gratitude, quiet and sincere. But the next morning brought a warning no one could ignore. The Granite Ridge weather station, little more than a cabin with a barometer and a telegraph line, sent word of a sudden, dramatic pressure drop. The kind that precedes violent, sustained storms. Air pressure that had been steady for weeks plunged so sharply that even the inattentive felt it in their ears. Deputy Wardell received the message first. He rode out to find Elias chopping wood outside the timber ring. Wardell dismounted, brow furrowed deeper than usual. "Barometer fell like a stone," he said. "Fastest drop we've recorded in 10 years. Elias didn't stop swinging the axe. "It will fall farther." Wardell exhaled, clouds of breath drifting into the cold air. "I don't know what it is," he admitted, "but something feels wrong." For the first time, the practical deputy, the man who trusted facts and measurements more than gut feelings, looked genuinely troubled. The signs were no longer whispers. They were warnings, and Granite Ridge had only just begun. Act 4. The Hammer Storm. The storm did not arrive like a whisper this time. It arrived like a fist. On the morning of December 9th, the valley awoke to a roaring so deep it seemed to shake the frozen ground. The snakebite wind had sharpened overnight, turning from a warning into a weapon. Snow kicked sideways across the open fields in long, blinding sheets, and the Bitterroot Mountains disappeared behind a wall of white. By mid-morning, gusts reached 80 miles per hour. By noon, they were hitting 95. Windows rattled in their frames. Smoke vanished sideways from chimney tops. Tarps that had covered wood piles for months were ripped into twisting ribbons within minutes, flung across the valley like scraps of paper. Even the heaviest canvas, weighted down with stones and nailed at the corners, lasted no more than a quarter of an hour before the wind tore it open, allowing snow to pour through every seam. And then the freezing began. In temperatures that fell faster than anyone could measure, split firewood left outside turned slick with ice in 15 to 20 minutes. Logs that had been seasoned since summer hardened into frozen blocks, impossible to ignite no matter how many matches were struck. Axes rebounded off them with dull, useless thuds. Lean-tos, the pride of many homesteaders, crumpled beneath the weight of wind-driven snow. What had once been sturdy shelters collapsed like wet cardboard. The storm did not just attack, it dismantled. Granite Ridge learned quickly which homes were ready. Most were not. The first cry for help came from the cobbler homestead. Their roof still held, but their exposed wood pile had frozen into a mound of glittering ice. Inside, their youngest boy lay wrapped in blankets, face pale, lips turning faint blue despite 2 adults hovering over the stove. The fire burned weakly, starved for usable fuel. Then came the Thomasons. Their chimney had caught a violent downdraft, wind driven straight down the flue, filling the cabin with smoke so thick they could barely see. Ash scattered across the floor as they tried desperately to restart the fire, but every log they fed it hissed and steamed, refusing to catch. Within hours, half the families in Granite Ridge were burning chairs, broken tool handles, anything dry enough to flame for even a moment. But the storm did not relent, and it was only getting started. Meanwhile, at the edge of the valley, the timber rings surrounding Elias's cabin groaned under the assault. Snow piled against the outer wall in drifts taller than a man's waist. The roof flexed, creaked, and held. Inside, Elias moved methodically, checking stacks, clearing vents, reinforcing braces like a captain tending his ship in a gale. But even his work was not immune to the storm's fury. Late in the afternoon, a gust stronger than any before ripped through the clearing. Somewhere in the woods, a dead branch, thick as a man's arm, snapped free and hurtled toward the timber ring like a spear. It slammed into the structure with a crack that echoed across the valley. One of the outer planks tore loose. Snow blasted through the gap. The first breach. Elias dropped the armload of wood he had been carrying. In an instant, the storm, howling, blinding, alive, rushed into the protected space. His heart hammered as he realized that if the breach widened, the entire ring could begin to peel apart like an orange skin. He grabbed his coat, pulled the hood tight, and shoved his shoulder against the door. Wind nearly ripped it from his hand. He stepped outside into a world of white chaos. The cold hit him like a blow. Needles of ice stung his exposed skin. The wind bent him sideways. Snow swirled so violently he could barely see the cabin behind him. But he forced himself forward. The broken plank flapped in the wind like a loose sail. Each time it struck the wall, it sent a spray of splinters into the air. Elias seized it with numb fingers and felt the wood tear at his palms. Blood mixed with snow. He didn't stop. He pulled a basalt stone, heavy, sharp-edged, from the foundation pile. With raw hands trembling, he wedged the stone into the gap, filling the breach the way his father had taught him decades ago in Karelia. Stone first, then board. Earth against sky. Strength against winter. The wind roared against him, whipping his coat, clawing at his hood. His breath froze against his beard. His fingers screamed with cold. But inch by inch, he forced the board back into place, hammering it with the heel of his hand until the wood sat flush with its neighbors. He packed snow around the base for temporary insulation, then pressed his weight against the finished repair. Only when he felt the wind deflect properly did he allow himself to breathe. He staggered back inside, hands bleeding, face burning, chest heaving. But the breach was sealed. The timber ring, his father's wisdom wrapped in Idaho lumber, had held. Inside the ring, the world felt shockingly different. Warmer. Still. Protected. The temperature remained 12 to 18 degrees warmer than outside, enough for Elias to keep moving, keep sorting, keep preparing. When he lifted another split log, it clapped cleanly against its neighbor with that dry, hollow sound woodsmen call wood singing, a sign of perfect dryness, perfect readiness. While the rest of Granite Ridge struggled with frozen, useless fuel, Elias's wood burned as easily as it had in early autumn. Still, the storm did not stop. Not after sundown, not after midnight, not even when the wind screamed high enough to rattle the stars. Granite Ridge lay buried in darkness, fighting for warmth with whatever scraps they could find. And as the night deepened, despair took hold. Not because the storm had peaked, but because it showed no sign of breaking. In the timber ring, Elias stood alone, listening to the wind hammering the outer walls. The worst was still coming. Act 5. The Night of Desperation. The storm reached its most violent hour just after dusk. Darkness thickened until the sky and the earth became one swirling mass of white and shadow. Snow hammered the timber ring like fists on a great drum. But inside, Elias kept moving, checking the fire, sorting wood by size, listening to the changes in the wind. And then, a sound cut through the howl. A thudding. A fist against the outer door. Faint. Frantic. The first knock. Elias pulled open the inner door and cracked the outer one just enough to let a figure stumble inside. It was Mark Cobbler, half frozen, dragging his young son in behind him. The boy's lips were pale, his fingers rigid, his breath shallow. "Our wood! It froze! Everything's ice," Mark gasped, eyes wild with fear. "Please, please, Elias!" There was no hesitation. Elias ushered them in, stripped the boy's outer coat, wrapped him in a wool blanket, and guided them toward the stove. Within minutes, the child's shivering eased as heat seeped back into his small body.
Come in quickly.
But the storm gave no pause. Moments later, another knock, stronger, more desperate, slammed against the outer wall. The second knock. Elias fought the wind to open the door again. This time, the Thomason family stood there, snow caked into their hair, clothes soaked, the mother clutching a newborn swaddled in several layers of cloth. The baby's small cries barely rose above the storm. "Our chimney!" It blew back, filled the whole cabin with smoke, Mr. Thomason choked out. "We couldn't breathe. The baby? He's freezing." Elias stepped aside at once. He took the newborn carefully, checking the tiny face, the bluish nose, the trembling lips. He knew what cold could do to a child that small. He rushed to the timber ring's storage bay, grabbed a small bundle of maple, a wood that burns hot and steady, and fed it into the stove until the flames rose bright and even. Martha once said maple felt comforting. Tonight, it was life. He held the small child's hands near the heat, rotating him gently. Mrs. Thomason wept silently as warmth slowly returned to her baby's cheeks. But the night was not done testing them. Between gusts of wind, another noise cut through. The heavy stomp of boots, a stumble, and then a crash against the door. The third knock. Elias braced himself and opened up to find Deputy Wardle. Half collapsed, blood streaked across his temple, snow packed into the folds of his coat. His hat was missing. His left arm hung useless at his side. "I was searching for the Kowalskis," he managed, voice thin. "Roof. Gone. Couldn't find them. Storm's too strong." He nearly fell, but Elias caught him and pulled him in before the wind could claim him. Wardle slumped near the fire, clutching his ribs, breathing in ragged bursts. Elias did what he could, pressed a warm compress to his head, checked his limbs, wrapped a blanket around him. "You saved lives," Elias told him softly. But Wardell shook his head. "Didn't save enough." Elias didn't answer. There was no point in speaking false comfort. The storm outside cared nothing for effort or bravery. For a brief moment, silence reigned, until the wind roared again, and another knock, so faint it nearly went unheard, tapped against the door. A tap, then another. Not a man's knock, a small one. The fourth knock. Elias opened the door and found Martha Callan, nearly buried under a drift, holding her youngest child tight against her chest. Snow crusted her eyelashes. Her voice quivered. "Elias, my roof is shaking. The wood's too wet. I can't get a fire. Please, please, help my babies." Her daughter clung to her skirt, crying softly. Elias stepped forward and swept the children inside first, guiding Martha through as the wind tried to pull the door from his grasp. When they reached the warmth of the cabin, Martha collapsed to her knees, clutching her children as tears finally broke free. "I tried," she whispered. "I tried to do everything you said. But the storm! Elias, it's worse than anything I've ever seen." He knelt beside her. "You did enough. You brought them here. That saved them." The timber ring was no longer just a structure. It had become the refuge of Granite Ridge. Within the next hour, Elias transformed his sheltered storage space into a makeshift command post. He organized the wood by burn speed and heat output, assigning each family a portion based on their needs. He showed the cobbler boy how to warm his hands without burning them. He instructed the Thomasons on how to keep smoke from backing into the stove. He tightened Wardell's bandages and rested him on a cot of split logs covered with blankets. And when Martha's little girl cried at the booming wind, Elias gently handed her a small piece of dry larch to hold. Warm, smooth, a reminder that something solid still existed in the chaos. Families huddled close. The fire glowed bright. The timber ring creaked but held. Outside, the storm continued its assault, a giant hammer pounding the valley without mercy. Inside, for now, there was warmth. There was breath. There was a chance. And all of it, every ember of hope, was centered around the structure the town once mocked. The night of desperation had begun, but the night of survival was only just Act 6. The 48 hours of survival, the next 2 days, blurred into something beyond time. A stretch of cold, fear, and endurance so long that sunrise and sunset became meaningless. The storm hammered Granite Ridge without rhythm, without mercy, as if determined to erase every structure that dared stand upright against its fury. Inside the timber ring, survival became a choreography. Elias barely slept. Every hour he inspected the vent slots, brushed away drifting snow, restacked fallen pieces of wood, and fed heat into the stoves according to each family's needs. The Thomason baby needed steady warmth, so he rationed the hottest burning maple for them. The cobblers, still recovering, received larch for long, even heat. For Wardell, he set a softer pine fire to keep the air warm but manageable for his injured lungs. He moved with quiet purpose, like a conductor ensuring no flame faltered. Martha became his second pair of hands. While Elias tended the fires, she watched over the children gathered in the main cabin, offering warm broth and stories to drown out the boom of the wind. Her voice, soft and steady, acted like another layer of insulation, protecting spirits, while Elias protected bodies. Every few hours, the wind changed pitch. Each shift signaled another burst of violence. By the second night, even the timber ring trembled under the assault. And then came disaster from the town. A distant crash, muffled but unmistakable, echoed through the storm. Wardell jolted upright despite his injuries. "That was the grain shed," he said, voice strained. "If that roof's gone, everything inside is done for." The grain shed was the town's lifeline. Tools, seed stock, emergency wheat, all stored under one large roof. If it failed, spring planting would fail with it. Elias grabbed his coat, already knowing what he had to do. Wardell, injured or not, forced himself up. "You shouldn't go," Martha whispered. "It's not safe." Elias met her eyes. "If the shed is open to the wind, the whole valley will starve come spring." Wardell tightened his scarf and gripped Elias's shoulder. "Let's move. Stay behind me on the drifts." They opened the timber ring door, and the wind struck like a physical blow. Elias almost recoiled, but then he angled his body and made use of his own creation. The timber ring blocked just enough of the crosswind to let them step out into the open. Its circular shape redirected the worst gusts, creating a narrow corridor of relative calm. a shield carved from wood and mathematics. They pushed through the whiteout, leaning into 70-mile gusts. Snow clawed at their legs, stinging their faces, filling their hoods. The wall of the grain shed emerged from the storm only when they were 10 feet away. What was left of it? Half the roof had collapsed inward. Wheat sacks spilled open along the floor, already crusted with ice. Tools lay scattered beneath beams snapped like matchsticks. Wardell swore under his breath. "We can't save it," he said. "No," Elias answered, "but we can save ourselves." They grabbed what tools they could salvage, hatchets, an iron kettle, a few lengths of rope, then fought the storm back toward the timber ring. Snowdrifts rose over their knees. Twice Elias nearly fell. Once Wardell had to drag him by the arm after an icy gust nearly spun him sideways. By the time they re-entered the timber ring, both men were pale, coughing, soaked in frozen sweat. But they were alive, and the structure had proven something vital. It was not merely a strong building, it was a storm-breaking machine. As Elias warmed himself near the stove, he finally allowed the others to see what he had built. Not just in function, but in design. He explained the geometry. A full 360-degree ring, eliminating weak points, reducing lateral wind force on any single wall by nearly 70%. A dead air gap, the space between the cabin wall and the outer ring, acting as a natural insulation chamber, trapping still air the way northern lodge builders had done for centuries. Crosswind venting, spaced carefully under the eaves, preventing moisture buildup and stopping snow from settling into the wood piles. A raised floor, 22 inches above the soil, keeping the wood dry and safe from the dreaded Idaho ground frost. The soil freeze that crept upward like a silent predator, ruining wood from below. The families listened, wide-eyed. They had mocked this system. Now it was the reason they were breathing. Hours passed. Children slept. Fires crackled. Wardell drifted off in a deep, exhausted sleep. The worst of the storm pounded somewhere above the ridge, but the timber ring held its breath and held its ground. During one brief lull, the wind softened, not stopping, but resting, like a fist drawing back before another blow. A small pocket of quiet settled over the ring. Martha stood beside Elias near the stacked birch, watching him rewrap his bleeding hand. "You saved my children," she said softly. Elias shook his head. "You saved them. You brought them here." Martha's eyes glistened. "You gave us a fire, a place to survive." He paused, fingers hovering over the knot of the bandage. His voice, when it came, was low and warm, despite everything around them. "No one lives through a winter alone, Martha. Not in Idaho. Not anywhere." Outside, the storm gathered strength once more. Inside, the people of Granite Ridge gathered closer. Around the men they once mocked. Inside the shelter they once laughed at, holding on to the fragile hope that the timber ring might carry them through whatever came next. The 48 hours of survival were not over, but they were still alive. And that meant the storm hadn't won. Act 7, Aftermath, and Twist. When the storm finally broke, it didn't stop suddenly. It faded, slow, exhausted, like a beast that had burned through its rage. On the morning of the third day, the wind loosened. The sky brightened from iron gray to ash white, and the first stillness in 70 hours settled over Granite Ridge. Families inside the timber ring listened, hardly daring to believe it was real. Elias pushed open the outer door. The storm had left behind a world changed. The valley stretched out in ruins. Snow drifts towered higher than wagon wheels. Roofs had caved in. Lean-tos were scattered like splinters. The grain shed lay flattened, half buried under jagged sheets of ice. Not a single tarp or woodpile remained standing. Granite Ridge looked less like a town and more like a battlefield. But people emerged, slowly, limping, shaken, from every corner of the timber ring. Parents pulled their children close.
We were wrong.
Deputy Wardell steadied himself on the fence. Martha held her youngest, who now slept peacefully for the first time in days. 17 people in total had taken refuge inside Elias's structure, 17 people who would have died without it. When the council finally arrived, faces pale, clothes torn, pride scattered, they said nothing at first. Their eyes traveled across the valley, tracing the destruction, then landed on the timber ring. The only structure untouched, the only building with smoke rising from its chimney, the only place where warmth still lived. Thomas Brigg, who had mocked Elias the loudest, lowered his head.
Elias, this yours?
"We were wrong," he said simply, voice gravel soft. No speeches, no excuses. Winter storms have a way of grinding arrogance into humility. While families slept or searched for salvage, Elias began clearing debris from within the ring. Snow had blown in from his quick repairs. Tools lay scattered near the workbench. A few collapsed bundles of spruce needed restacking. Martha stepped in to help. As she lifted a snow-covered crate, something light slid out and hit the floor with a soft thud. A small wooden box, weathered smooth from age, bound with a thin strip of leather. The kind of thing someone hides not because it is expensive, but because it is irreplaceable. She hesitated. "Elias, this yours?" He froze. For a long moment he didn't move, just stared at the box, as if unsure whether he wanted the past pulled into the present. Then he knelt, wiped the snow from its lid, and opened it carefully. Inside lay a single fragment of wood. Dark, old, polished by hands, long gone. But it wasn't just a keepsake. It was a curved piece of his father's storm ring from Karelia, the one that had saved his family when the blizzard of 1893 buried their entire village. The only reason he was alive. Martha's voice broke the silence. "What is it?" Elias ran a thumb across the old grain, eyes distant. "It was part of my father's ring. He built it with his own hands. When the Karelia storm came, our cabin should have been crushed. But the ring held. It saved us." He swallowed, breath visible in the cold. "I didn't build mine because I'm clever, Martha, or because I wanted to be different." A pause. "I built it because I owed this design my life." She stared at the shard of wood. Others who had gathered fell silent, forming a quiet circle around him. Martha whispered, "Then your father saved us too." Elias didn't look up. "No," he said. "You saved yourselves by trusting something strange, something untested." Wardell stepped forward, leaning heavily on a cane improvised from a broken roof beam. "Untested," he said. "It was tested a long time ago, just not by us." The moment felt like a scene from a different world. A room full of survivors standing around a small fragment of wood that had bridged continents and generations, carrying one idea simple enough to cross oceans. Build for the worst, not the expected. Spring thaw came late that year, but when it came, Granite Ridge changed with it. Within weeks, families began building their own versions of the timber ring, scaled down, adapted, simplified. 11 cabins added protective arcs along the north walls. 3 built full rings. Some used pine, some used larch, some used salvaged boards from collapsed sheds. But every one of them used Elias's principles. Children stopped calling it the drum house behind his back. They now ran past it shouting, "Snow shield!" and sometimes storm wall. Deputy Wardell, once skeptical, placed a new line in the official town logbook. Wind breaks save more lives than warnings. By the time summer arrived, Granite Ridge had become a different place. One shaped not by the storm that nearly killed it, but by the man whose quiet preparation had saved it. On the final shot, the camera lifts slowly above the valley. Smoke rises from rebuilt chimneys. New timber arcs curve around cabins like protective arms, and the original timber ring stands at the center, scarred, repaired, unbowed. The wind sweeps gently across the valley as the voiceover begins. In a land where the wind is the true enemy, the survivor is never the strongest, never the fastest, never the bravest, but the one who prepares for the worst that winter can bring. The drone climbs higher. The valley fades into white, and the story of Granite Ridge becomes another